Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening on our own ongoing celebration of Black History Month. My name is Caroline Dramaguet. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Museum of History. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the museum is located is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Acknowledging where we are and working closely with Indigenous communities and partners across Canada is vitally important to the museum as we move forward together in a spirit of collaboration and respect. So tonight, we will be screening Claiming Space, the final episode of the groundbreaking series Black Life Untold Stories, an 8-part documentary series that reframes the rich and complex histories of Black experiences in Canada. And if you haven't watched the series yet, I highly recommend it. All 8 episodes are available to watch on the CBC GEM platform. Canada is a country that has been deeply enriched by the lives and experiences of the many peoples who live here. Black Canadians have left an indelible mark on our nation's history and story, from trailblazers in history to everyday heroes in our communities. Yet, the shadow of anti-Black racism persists, perpetuating inequality that is so harmful. In 2018, Canada endorsed the UN Decade for People of African Descent, reaffirming Canada's commitment to empowerment and equality. Last evening, here at the museum, during the Black Excellence Gala, the Prime Minister announced an extension of this support until 2028, pledging to amplify Black voices, promote entrepreneurship, and advance social issues. As we come together this evening, we celebrate Black history and the many contributions of Black Canadians and the richness and diversity of this country. So tonight, we present this event in partnership with Black Life Impact Foundation. Our partnership with the foundation has been truly exceptional. Together, we have worked on the creation of 4 Teacher Zone modules on Black history in Canada. 2 packages will be available later this month on our website, and 2 more will be added in the spring. These educational packages include activity suggestions, virtual objects, videos, and background information, which provide teachers and educators with tools they need to give their students engaging and memorable classroom experiences. This same partnership has also resulted in the production of watch guides to accompany each of the 8 episodes of the CBC docuseries. Designed specifically for teachers and students, these guides provide additional context for the stories unfolding on screen, bringing community voices and rich stories directly into classrooms across the whole country. This importance of sharing these contributions with young people in Canada cannot be underestimated. And part of our mission here is to involves ensuring that everyone in Canada feels welcomed and that they see themselves represented in everything that we do at the museum. Tonight's event and this partnership speak directly to that ongoing commitment. The Black Life Untold Stories episodes we will be showing and discussing this evening examines the migrations and displacements of Black Canadians to places as widespread as Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montreal, and Africville. Displacement and migrations are themes that are undeniably woven into our shared story. In the Canadian History Hall, which is our flagship exhibition here at the museum, for example, you will see the story of Africville and the stories of residential schools, wartime internees, refugees, and immigrants from all over the world. I really, truly hope you will enjoy tonight's screening, which will be followed by a panel discussion and Q&As, and that you are able to stay with us for a reception afterwards. So again, my sincere thanks to the Black Life Impact Foundation. It has been a pleasure working and partnering with all of you in the development of these important resources. And my colleagues and I look forward to building our work and to continue to build our work together. So let us honor our past, confront our present, and shape the future we can all be proud of and where we can thrive and flourish. So before I introduce the next speaker, I have one small housekeeping note. If you haven't had a chance to pick up a headset at the entrance of the theater and would prefer to hear the discussions en français, we will invite you to perhaps pick one up after the screening of this first episode. I believe we have plenty of headsets if you do want to grab one. So, excuse me. So to all of our guests, thank you again for joining us this evening. So an evening like this would not be possible without the series sponsor TD Bank Group. I would now like to invite Anna Hughes-Moreau, Vice President, Operations and Delivery, Enterprises, Shared Services, to say a few words. Hannah, that's a long title, Hannah.
Merci, Caroline. It is an honor to be here on behalf of TD. And as we recognize the importance of Black History Month, and not only that, as we celebrate Black contributions to Canadian history and everyday life. La TD commandite des événements et des initiatives pour le mois de l'histoire des Noirs depuis plus de 15 ans. Nous reconnaissons l'importance de ce mois non seulement en tant que célébration, mais aussi en tant que rappel de notre engagement continu à aider à ouvrir la voie à un avenir plus équitable et inclusif. Through our corporate citizenship platform, the TD Ready Commitment, we are leveraging the power of our people, business, and philanthropy to support projects and programming year-round that aim to break down barriers to access and inclusion, to amplify diverse voices, and to help drive systemic change. We're continuing to put our words into action both inside the bank and beyond our walls. And we know that this year has been particularly challenging as many people have had to make difficult choices as a result of rising costs of basic necessities. That's why it is more important now more than ever that we continue to support the Black-focused, Black-led, and Black-serving organizations and change makers that are making a difference in their communities. This year, or rather, it's already 2024, in 2023, we announced the TD Pathways to Economic Inclusion, which focuses our efforts on helping to improve access to employment training, development, financial services, education and advice, and affordable housing. And we also launched the Black Entrepreneur Credit Access Program, aimed at providing more equitable access to credit for Black entrepreneurs who, as we know, disproportionately face hurdles securing funding for their businesses. Nous savons qu'il y a encore un chemin à faire, et nous nous engageons à marcher de l'avant ensemble et à célébrer et à soutenir les communautés, les clients et les collègues noirs que nous servons aujourd'hui et à l'avenir. Au nom de la TD, merci Caroline et l'équipe du musée. C'est grâce au travail de nombreuses organisations communautaires remarquables que des changements significatifs sont possibles. TD is proud to support efforts to help write tomorrow's history and inspire generations to come. And with that, I am humbled and honored to welcome our award-winning author, producer, and activist, Sandy Hudson, co-executive producer of Black Lives, Untold Stories. Thank you all. Enjoy.
Ooh, good evening. This is a Black event, everybody, okay? We speak to each other. Thank you so much for being here, and happy Black History Month, happy Black Futures Month, happy Black Liberation Month, however it feels to you. You know, I just a few words before we get to this screening. I just want to make sure that you all know what a magnificent project this was. We started talking about this back in 2019, or at least I was brought into discussions about this back in 2019. And then, there was a lot of world events that produced quite a few delays, and it was hard to make something like this happen in the way that it happened. And one of the reasons I am so pleased about how this came together is because of how many Black people across the country got to be a part of it. Now, the episode you're going to see tonight is directed by Frances Ann Solomon, but each episode, if you haven't seen them yet on GEM, each episode is directed by a different Black director and had a different team. And so each of them look a little different, and they stand alone, and they are showcasing Black talent as much as they're showcasing Black history as part of the project. And I think that that is a marvelous achievement that should be celebrated. So this episode tonight, Claiming Space, you're gonna travel from British Columbia through the prairies to Montreal to Nova Scotia, and we're gonna talk about what it is like to try to carve out a space as a people who are constantly seeking refuge. That is one of the ways that Blackness, the experience of Blackness, manifests is, having to carve out a space for yourself and continually carve out that space, even when it feels like you've already done it, in order to thrive, because so often people are trying to take us away or make it uncomfortable or impossible for us to exist where we are. It is a situation that continues to this very day worldwide. And so as you watch this episode and any other episode, this is, as much as it is an education about Black history, it is also an education about our present. And it calls on us to take action in our present in the ways that some of the more awful things that you'll hear about tonight continue. And so I encourage you to think about that as you're watching the episode and the episodes. They range from talking about some of the difficult things that Black people have gone through in Canada to celebration. But really think deeply about how we can shift the situation that continues to this very day, whether we're talking about people who are seeking refuge literally as refugees here, or the ways that Black communities continue to this very day to not get the support that they need and often have to deal with systemic forms of discrimination and harming the people in those communities that through it all still live through it, still continue to thrive, and still continue to make the community as we always have. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to whomever it is up there who presses whatever buttons to get this started. And I hope you enjoy the episode, and we'll see you afterwards for the panel.
Hey everyone, my name is David Thurton. I'm a senior reporter with CBC News in the Parliamentary Bureau, and it's so good to be with you. Happy Black History Month. I'm going to get each of my panelists to introduce themselves and answer my first question, but I'll just say one other thing. I've had the pleasure working for the public broadcaster, getting to work in different communities and places in the Maritimes, up in the Arctic, in northern Alberta. And my aunt who lives in Toronto asked me one time, because that's where I was born, how do you be a Black person if you're not in Toronto? And that question always stuck with me because we have this image in Canada that there are certain communities and certain places where you can only be Black or live your true Black identity. And obviously in the piece that we just saw, that's not necessarily the case. So, Hando, I'm going to get you to introduce yourself, but also tell me, in answering the first question, what does blackness, what does black identity and black community look like where you're from? And tell us where you're from.
I guess, thanks for the question. Where I'm from is complicated. If I wanted to historicize myself, I would say I'm a black person from continental Africa, Sierra Leone, that can trace his heritage all the way back to Nova Scotia. So there's a reversal there of how you think of blackness. So I'm a professor of education at UBC, and speaking of those untold stories, untold presences, I think the West Coast, Vancouver, blackness, we always say it's hard being black in Vancouver, is where I'm at. I'm immigrant. I'm part of how strange blackness is in its diversity, in its the diverse nation, the singular nation of how it is to be black in Vancouver. It's diverse because people have come from so many different places. Continental Africa is how people think of the black presence, and I'm part of that. There's also people from the Caribbean. There's also people who are black and Canadian who've been around for generations. And even if you just think of continental Africans, there are organizations for people from every country. And then there are communities and ethnicities from all of those different places. And yet we're a very small number. I think it's something like 40-something or 60-something thousand in all of BC, 30-something in Metro Vancouver. And so it is only in February that we're insistently called upon to be black. And after that, people forget about our presence. And as I tell people, you know, we can do this thing you're asking me to do in April or in July. I'll still be black, you know, you can still invite me. So that's a sense of, this series resonated so much with me about your idea about what it means to be black. I don't think you want to do the black nod in Toronto, but you definitely do the black nod in Vancouver. It is there and it is needed.
We do it sometimes here in the nation's capital, in the capital region.
It's in Toronto. What?
In Toronto, but less so. Okay, so David Austin, let's go to you. Why don't you take it away?
Well, first of all, good evening to everybody. I mean, before I answer directly the question, I just wanted to say that, and it's related to something that Sandy said at the beginning. You know, it's quite something to see this series come to fruition. After several years, it's 2024 right now. I remember also when it was just a conversation. Leslie Norval and some other people visited Montreal and were talking about this possible series. And to see it materialize and capture so much of the history and presence in the present too of people of African descent in this country is really important. And for one of the episodes, Revolution Remix, which is about the 1960s in Montreal, I remember calling Robert Hill, who's from Jamaica, professor for many years of African American and Black diasporic history at UCLA, to tell him that they wanted to interview him for this series. And he was in Jamaica at the time, and there was this kind of pause. And he was kind of choked up, like borderline crying, you know, thinking about the reality that history that he had been a part of and helped to make in the 1960s between Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, actually, was now going to be history of another kind in the form of film. So, you know, it says something about the cycles of life and how these things get passed down from one generation to the next. But I also mention him because his uncle, one of his uncles, who's a well-known political person in Jamaica going back to the 1930s and 40s, was a close friend of my grandfather in Jamaica. My parents are both Jamaican. from Spanish Town, St. Elizabeth and Kingston, and other parts of Clarendon also. And, you know, I think in many respects, my own journey as somebody who was born in England and lived there for the first 10 years of my life, then moved to Montreal, and then Toronto, and then back to Montreal, kind of reflects one of many journeys that reflects the lives of people of African descent in this country. Montreal is, well, every city is unique in its own way, but Montreal is particular because of the politics associated with language and culture, and the fact that it attracts a wide range of people of very diverse backgrounds, from the Congo, Senegal, Haiti, of course, which has the largest black population, and people from the so-called Anglophone Caribbean, as well as from Cuba and other places. So it's a city that has been enriched by the presence of people of African descent, both politically, artistically, and culturally, in ways that we're beginning to be able to capture in film, in books, and in stories. So in many respects, this series is like a snapshot, even though it's 8 parts and quite elaborate. In many respects, it's the beginning of telling stories, actually, because there's so much more to be said about how people of African descent are a relatively small population, comparatively speaking, especially in relation to the States, have disproportionately helped to shape this society.
Sandy, tell us about yourself and answer the question.
Sure. I'm Sandy. I'm a writer and activist, and I am from Toronto, second generation immigrant. My parents were born in Jamaica and came to Canada in different ways, and we grew up in a very working class lifestyle. My father continues to work servicing planes at Toronto Pearson Airport, and my mother, for much of my life, was what would be considered a stay-at-home mom, but she was also running one of those childcare centers that many immigrant women run, and so we had a lot of children in our house and taking care of people through the time that I was growing up. And so for me, my parents thought it was very important that we had a handle on Black history and how our family came to be in Canada, which was mostly through the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, through my great-grandparents and my great-grandmother on my mother's side and my grandmother on my father's side. They did not meet in Jamaica, though they're both from St. Mary. They met in Canada and had a very similar history of coming to Canada, leaving a lot of their family behind and coming in stages, taking care of siblings while they were trying to get the rest of the family there. And for me, my experience of Blackness was a lot of movement. I was born in what was called at the time North York, or well, I was born in Scarborough. Moved to North York. And, you know, there's these periods where you know, jobs are lost and communities are shifted, the way that communities are set up, and you're forced to move. So I lived in Scarborough, I lived in North York before the city's amalgamation, I lived in Brampton, I lived in Maple, and I lived in Toronto. I was all over the city. And, you know, looking at, you know, if you followed at all what's happened in Toronto and Little Jamaica, you know, that sort of disrespect for Black community and the forced sort of shifting and migration of Black community, it happens all the time in Toronto. And, you know, getting to work on this documentary and also some of the work that I've done academically in studying this, it's like really is one of the ways that Blackness shows up in Canada, is this forced, like even when you start to settle, there's a forced movement. And in my own life, personally, I think that forced movement results in my experience feeling like I'm somewhere where I'm not supposed to be. And then continually trying to carve out that place, being like, I'm gonna be here. You know, that felt like the entire way that I would describe how it felt like to grow up in all of those different places. And it still feels like what I'm doing right now. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Cheryl, you were featured in this episode. All of these folks, by the way, are featured in some way or fashion throughout the series, but you were specifically featured in this episode. And you could provide that prairie representation and that prairie perspective to show that, you know, Black people existed for a long time out west.
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's great to be in your company tonight. And I want to start by saying thank you to Sandy and all those who are involved in creating this incredible series that, as David Austin said, there are 3 Davids up here, so I have to be specific. This is just like a taste. You know, this could be an 80-part series and still not tell all the stories. But a lot of times we think about that sort of thing, oh, there are so many stories to tell and we never get started, and yet you folks got started, so thank you. Yes, I am William and Katie Glover and Rufus and Drusilla Smith's great-granddaughter. Here because of my love for my people and my incredible regard for them. What does Blackness look like where I live? You know, I think our numbers are always undercounted. That's something that I've learned through my research. I'll very briefly share an anecdote about going to look for a Black man that I knew was Black, and I knew he was in Calgary in 1914. So I went to the 1911 census, and I found his name, but in the transcript, he was listed as Norwegian. And I thought, okay, you know, maybe there's another person by this name who was Norwegian. So I did my cross-referencing, which I have to do all the time in my work, and came back to it and realized, no, this is definitely him. And then looked on the page and saw that there were about 10 other people living in one apartment building in 1911 on 4th Street in Calgary who were all listed as Norwegian. Did a little bit more digging, and sure enough, it turned out that they were all Black. Anyway, our numbers are often undercounted in what many people consider to be primary research sources. So you may not think of Calgary as a Black space, but I do. I think of every corner of the city of Calgary as a Black space. There are many young Black people living in my city, though, who don't feel welcome or who feel or who are made to feel like they don't belong. So my entire life is about helping them to understand, no, you belong here, and we've been here not as long as everybody. We haven't been here for 10,000 years, like the first people, but you've been here, people who look like you have been here from the beginning of white presence here. I think if you ask different people, what does blackness look like in Calgary, they would have different answers, because as I think Handel said about Vancouver, we have people from all over the world, Black people from all over the world, and many of them have their own groups and support networks. And so you have to kind of choose to live in Blackness that is inclusive of all those groups. And a lot of that choosing happens in the arts community. So for me, Blackness in Calgary looks like the arts. But I actually have 2 answers, and my second answer is that I walk with ghosts everywhere I go. I live a shadow life in a Black past in my city. I was born there. Um, I, I still live there. I know every corner of the city. And I know that there was Black presence in all those places. So for a lot of people, they think of Bowness Park in Northwest Calgary. For me, that's a Black space because my Black uncle was the landscaper who planted those trees. And because he was a preacher and he insisted upon our joy being present in that park. So we had picnics there all the time. And my family still goes there all the time. It will always be a Black space for me. So that's my double answer, that Blackness in Calgary is incredibly diverse. Choosing to live in Black community is a choice, and that I walk with those ghosts everywhere because we were everywhere.
David Woods, you're based in Halifax. How would you answer this question?
First, I'd like to say welcome, and thanks for the invite. Museum of History, who have had quite an interesting history with. So it's really glad to be here. The last time I was here, we did Untold Stories, a play. So I'm born in Trinidad and grew up in Scotia. And I've learned now, because there's now a new wave of indigenization, claiming that's real important to some folks. Never did matter to me. But I say that because my journeys have been defined by others, but my real journey, because I grew up without my parents, kind of like orphaned mentally and all that. Well, my uncle, from a very early age, started giving me books. I was a voracious reader, and so I learned everything about Black people. And I didn't know that that was unusual until I got to Canada, because then I realized I was living next to a slave plantation when I was a kid. A little white man down in a little village there, selling mangoes and everything else, and owned everything in sight, called Mr. Jellizo, and the word was that that little white man and his wife, just the two of them, would shoot you if you stole from him. Which didn't make no sense, because how would he know you were stealing from his stuff, which I did. But then it suddenly hit me. I was living next to the slave plantation all them years, and nobody told me. And then I got to Dartmouth High School. I was the president of the student council, and they said, hey, there's a job out in Preston where all the Black people live, and they gave me the job, and all the Black people who were the other council said, oh, you're not going to survive without children. So then we went out in the woods with the children, and I fell in love with them. And then they said, you know, you cool, Dave. You got to come up home to meet my peoples. So I went up home, and I never left. Because we went to the Fraser house, because one of the daughters was really cute. But then the mother looked me up, and she really liked me, so she made me one of her children. She already had 15, so I was number 16. And for the rest of my life, I could not keep away, because every weekend, I'd leave my family house to go up there, and there'd be like 30 cars in the yard, because everybody went to Mom May's house. And she made 2 meals on the weekends, one for the family, one for the visitors. It was singing, step dancing. Everybody in the village called North Preston dropped in, just like they had to do that, just to. There was Dave Woods. Got so bad, when the grandchildren came around, it was a big joke, because the father had died, and one of the aunts said, pointed at me, and she asked one of the little children, about 4 years old, who's that? She goes, oh, that's Mom May's boyfriend. But Nova Scotia is really interesting, because there were about 30 Black communities. Scotians will tell you 50, because they keep adding. But they were very static, you know. Their lives were very circumscribed, so you could define them all. They had a church. They usually only had one profession. Everybody lumbered, or they worked in the woods, or in Preston they built roads. So everybody was in the same pot. and everybody did the same things. And you couldn't move in town because they wouldn't rent you places in town, so you could define all that. But that life is broken down now because, you know, people have moved to other venues. And so you have an old world of static communities, of older people, dying communities, declining churches. Then you have the city, of course. You know, the African people migrated to the city. And for the first time since 2018 or so, the government woke up one day and found out that the average age in Nova Scotia was like close to 50. And they didn't have enough people to maintain even their small villages. So they finally had immigration. So now we have people from Africa and Jamaica and in real numbers. And we have black doctors, and all the little white villages that have Catholic churches have black priests. And it's really freaky because Nova Scotia used to pride itself on its very stratified racism. Now when I drive around to Cape Breton and all them places, a little black doctor looking after Miss Lucy. So, and then you have the New World. And I've been lucky because I had jobs that took me to all those places. I'm one of the few that visited, interacted with almost everybody. And then as people died, I realized I was the reservoir of knowledge that was never shared. So I write plays, I create shows, I do all kinds of stuff because I get very troubled when people pass and their stories haven't been, you know. So right now I have a show called The Secret Codes. It's touring Canada. It's in Toronto right now. We're hoping to bring it here. 100 years of African Nova Scotian quilts. And just finished a play on the No. 2 Construction Battalion. But as Blackness, personally, and I'm very much like Cheryl, I always felt I belonged to all of it. So I never defined myself as foreign or not foreign. And, you know, so when I entered places, it was always with the sense of, I'm really interested. And I asked questions and made people laugh, and I knew enough to kind of fit in. One of my great friends was Wanda Robson, sister of Viola Desmond. We hung around for 20 years. I didn't know what her husband thought of it, because we talked to each other every night. She was here last year, I think, well, a few years ago. And she told me all the stories of Viola Desmond, and actually, because of our interaction, she actually began that whole process that ended up with her on $10 bill.
David Woods, let me just jump in here.
Yeah, I better stop. Yeah.
Yeah, just because we could.
Oh, yeah.
Your relationship and the history of Nova Scotia is so rich, and we could talk forever about that.
I'm done.
But let me just maybe take the conversation in this direction. We've just spoke about black spaces and what that looks like in the places that we are and what that has looked like in the past. I'm wondering how we preserve blackness and black spaces now when it's changed so much. We don't have black churches anymore. Well, we still do, but I don't know how well they're attended. Black neighborhoods, right? It's really hard to identify that. I'm wondering how we preserve and we carve out those black spaces now when our communities maybe are so fragmented. Sandy, do you want to handle that question, take that?
Sure. Well, the first thing that immediately comes to mind is that, and it was said in the doc, it's kind of impossible what they've tried. You know, when you try to tell a community that they don't belong and you try to split them up, they will find each other in the celebrations that we have, in the places that we can create for one another. So, you know, I said that I grew up in Toronto, and I mentioned Eglinton, Little Jamaica. You know, no matter where we lived in the city, and even when we were living outside of the city, every other Sunday, we went to Sunlight Bakery to get freshly baked hard dough bread. And my dad would go to Wisdom's to get his hair cut, and my brother
The barbershop, yeah.
to the barbershop. You know, we were going to to the salon, so. At the same time, and going to those places on Eglinton, even though we were being pushed out, on the weekends, we went to Eglinton. That's where we were on the weekends. And there's a similar sort of experience along Bathurst. There's a similar experience when you think about things like the festivals that we have, like Caravana and so on. There's ways that we are always coming together, and so that even when there is success in pushing people out economically, there's a way that spiritually you can't really remove people from one another if they are connected. Now, I think that there is a importance in trying to continue to carve out that space and to refuse to leave and to make sure that we are connected through space. I think about places, again, referencing where I live, like a different book list, which has become the Blackhurst Community Center, which has such a importance in the community. It looked like during a condo build development situation that it was going to be destroyed, but people came together and said absolutely not, and created, through both art and activism and community effort of coming together, created a situation where now that place is going to survive through this condo development. And so I think that there's a way that
activism.
And
Yeah.
I think that there's a way that we need to be active and to be activist in trying to maintain those spaces and create those spaces. Absolutely.
Handel, I know you have some ideas about this, because this was, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I'll say to structure this is I think Blackness has never recovered from the loss of Hogan's Alley, Black Strathcona in Vancouver. It was the place where Blackness existed, together with, relatively recently, after the settlement of Salt Spring Island, after the African Rifles, one or two people who became prominent, Milton Gibbs, et cetera, in Victoria. Blackness has never recovered from the destruction of the Black community that was Hogan's Alley, or as I prefer to call it, Black Strathcona. And what that has meant is that Blackness is dispersed. And Vancouver is so expensive that most Black people cannot live in Vancouver. So there are Black people in the suburbs, in Surrey, in New Westminster, and they're not together. Blackness is dispersed. And so it's very hard to bring community together. So what has happened? How have people done this? So Blackness, to me, happens in ways that are no longer permanent. We don't have the luxury of saying we're going to, there's a Hogan's Alley Society that's trying to recover something. But what happens is that people come together in ethnic restaurants, a Nigerian restaurant, or a Jamaican restaurant, in nightclubs maybe, in particular countries having picnics in the summer. I think of it almost as pop-up Blackness, pop-up community. That's how it has to be, right? But Black people find a way to make it happen. And most interestingly, and we don't talk about this enough maybe elsewhere, is Blackness is online. I live in Richmond. I come from work. If I want to be in a community, I go on Facebook. And there's one Facebook group called Meanwhile Black in Vancouver. If you come to Vancouver, this is the first thing you're told: join Meanwhile Black in Vancouver. There's like 30,000 people in Metro Vancouver who are Black, And about 5,000 of us belong on Meanwhile Black in Vancouver. So these are the very innovative ways in which people are remaking. We should not take community for granted. For us way out on the West Coast, it's not a matter of the resilience, how do you still maintain that community was destroyed, and I don't think Blackness ever recovered from that destruction. So now it's a matter of how do we connect? When can we come together within our specificities and in spite of our differences sometimes? So the launch of Black History Month in the city of Vancouver is a very big deal for most folks in Vancouver. So I think it's happening in very innovative ways, and some of the ways, including online presence, might be ways that we're underestimating the importance of.
Okay. I think at some point we're going to be taking audience questions. There's a mic floating around. If you have a question, maybe raise your hand or comment. We'd be happy to bring the microphone to you. Or, Katie, am I getting this wrong? There are microphones. Okay, yeah, there are microphones just so you can see at the mid-level range. If you just line up at the mic, we can take your question. So while you all are working up the courage to do that, let me ask this. We're gathered in the National Capital Region. I came here in 2019. I've noticed that this has increasingly become more and more a Black space as we see more Black MPs, more Black senators. We see the Black class action lawsuit where federal civil servants are suing the federal government or hoping to sue the federal government. I'm wondering, David Austin, if you can answer this question, if you could take this question. Because your role in this docuseries was talking about policing, right? And law enforcement's impact on Black bodies and Black lives in Montreal. So has the increasing Blackification of Ottawa, if I could say that, if I could use that expression, has that changed the political or policy environment when it comes to how the federal government targets our communities, you think?
I don't think so. I mean, it's a short answer. I mean, I think, I watched several of the episodes multiple times, and, seeing the destruction of Little Burgundy and the other communities, but particularly Little Burgundy, because it's a community I know very well. I used to work in that neighborhood. In many respects, as Handel said, that community has never recovered from, and there's an economic loss, right? Like, people own their homes and were never compensated for them, right? So you think about homes as capital and what that means in terms of what, we might describe as intergenerational wealth, right? And then we look at today at the statistics in terms of unemployment, rates of poverty, and so on, right? It's all reflected, in that experience going back to that time. It's not mentioned in this particular episode, but, what replaced those homes was one of the largest government housing schemes in Quebec, right? Public housing. And with all the attendant problems that come with that in terms of lack of resources, less well-equipped schools, even just availability of basic things like grocery stores and, healthy food and things like that. And Black folks still, well, up until recently, was still in that neighborhood in large numbers. It's more scattered now. And, the attendant problems in terms of policing, and surveillance, in terms of being tied up with the judicial system, and high rates of incarceration, are all tied to that experience, which, and this is why I think it's so important to have a historical perspective, because our communities are pathologized as being crime-ridden and, poor, as if poverty just falls from the sky, right? And, we can trace these issues and problems to these moments that are captured in these episodes. And you know, our dilemma is a Du Boisian dilemma. W.B. Du Bois talked about the problem of the color line, but when he talked about this word problem, right, he was really asking the question, what happens to a people who have been emancipated, right, but yet remain unfree, right? And part of the answer to that has been, policing, surveillance, ill-equipped schools, precarious employment, and we can see that, there are a number of people, academics, professionals of various kinds who, symbolically represent the fact that some things have changed quite dramatically, right, for some folks. But what it really is an example of how you can have progression and regression at the same time, because there are more people incarcerated today than there were in the 1960s, right? So, yeah, it's a fundamental problem that I think doesn't go away until the structures and infrastructure that reproduces these problems go away. And that's part of a larger and wider issue, problem, and struggle. I just wanted to add one thing, though, which is relation to the question that you asked Handel to respond to, and that is that, I think we also, in terms of spaces, music is really important, right? In terms of sustaining communities. The church that we saw in the film also is a church, and it's a meeting ground, and it's actually a church that does a lot of work in terms of folks who are recently released from incarceration, so they do prisoner justice work of a certain kind. But song, spirituality, music, and we underestimate also the importance of the role that art, including visual art and literature. There's an episode that talks about artists, one of the episodes that addresses, deals with art and artists in the Canadian context. So these are all a part of what have helped sustain people of African descent in what has historically been and continues to be a hostile environment, if we're being very honest.
How about you, Cheryl? Do you want to answer this question?
Which one?
Well, either one, but I mean, I guess this question about whether or not the changing color of our politicians, whether or not we have the fact that we have more black parliamentarians here in Ottawa, we're also seeing more black MLAs or MPPs out in the prairies. Has that changed whether or not government policies and the politics changes from targeting our communities to helping them thrive?
I agree with David Austin that it still remains to be seen.
Yeah.
This is a pretty recent shift that you're describing, and I'm old enough to know that you sometimes have to wait and see. I will also say that simply counting numbers isn't the answer, because I'm somewhat hesitant to say this, but I'm going to say it. There are black people who don't love us and don't love themselves, and sometimes they enter politics. So it's not simply the numbers, it's also, the quality of the person and their desire to not pull up the ladder when they get there, and to reach out to other communities. So I guess I'm in a wait and see mode.
Okay, I'm going to look into the audience and see if we have any questions. I think we have one, yeah.
Considering, and I hope I am not going to offend anybody, the mature age of most of you, how do you motivate? How do you keep the motivation? Because most of this history has been swept under the carpet. And how do you find motivation in youth in the new generation? Considering the disparity of the different culture in the Black community and maybe the lack of interest, or is there any? like how you rally people around what you hope to do. I lived everywhere in this country, so I know Vancouver, from Halifax to Newfoundland. I know how it is, and I know people from everywhere, so I wonder how you proceed from one end of the country to the other. How do you find the arguments?
In the 1980s, we started a youth group called the Cultural Awareness Youth Group and established it in all the schools in Halifax. And we allowed the young people to kind of define a space within environments that were very hostile. When at that time there was no Black history, no Black teachers, etc. Those groups triumphed, and almost all the participants of that group became almost a generation that is leading our community today. So one thing that taught me, because I was very involved in that process, at one time we had 15 youth groups in the schools, is that there is a hunger, and you have to provide knowledge and information and structure that allows people to, it's not a matter of, that people are not interested or unmotivated. It's a matter of that there has to be a house, a home for their different interests. And when people discovered that they could be part of things that allowed them to triumph, they did. And this is without funding, this is without all the usual things that attach to running programs. So they had their own TV show, and they had their own Black history quizzes, and they had their own travel to other communities. And everybody kind of opened up in different ways, in art, in music, and yeah. So I think a lot of it is providing knowledge to folk and not assuming that people are sort of mentally tuned out, because in a sense, we live in the world, we want to be a part of who we are, and a lot of times it's just not having a space or the nurturing that allows you to grow. Just like why my uncle with books that allowed me to transform the books with a vehicle. And so I think we always have to think that we have to create structures. Like I think we should all have cultural centers in all our cities, for example.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because to transcend all our different, we could always talk about how different we are, but in a center, that becomes an ongoing dialogue that allows people to grow and to see and to, so we need to have spaces that allow people to become part of the larger idea of themselves.
Okay, we have a question over here, but before we go to you, ma'am, Handel, I think you wanted to quickly answer this as well.
Yeah, I'll just complicate the question by saying that I don't know that it's about mentoring the youth or anything like that. Youth are very interested and are very engaged. I would like to make a connection between what people know, what people don't know, and forms of institutional racism. I'm involved with a small group that has been fighting almost forever. People like Sadie Cohen had been doing this for years before me, and it is still so difficult to get Black history, I would prefer Blackness rather than just history, into the BC curriculum. Now, it's not just about Black kids knowing about themselves, but it's about everybody knowing about Blackness. And if you're struggling to get that into the curriculum, it's not about whether the kids are interested, it's about whether the institutions are even allowing this knowledge in the door. And there's a thriving, what David Austin mentioned about the arts. There's amazing art being produced in places like Surrey, young Black people curating work that is, to me, just mind-blowing. The Black arts that is going on and thriving there. So it's what are the outlets? What are the ways in which some of us that are now pretty long in the tooth can say we can still do our old ways of advocating? The activists are there, young activists, very much there. People need to know and be able to do more. We also need the institutions to come on board and to address the anti-Black racism that exists in our institutions that are making these things a perpetual problem that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Really, just thank you. I'm filled with gratitude. I'm from Montreal. I went to the NCC. I learned to dance there. My family would travel there every Saturday. For you, it was bread. For me, it was dance classes. And I was able to bring that here to Ottawa. I teach Afro-Caribbean dance and have done so for 30 years. Unfortunately, the pandemic, well, things happen. But the legacy lives on in a different way. I'm totally filled with gratitude. Honestly, I am. And I was so moved by that piece because I saw myself. And in the spirit of Sankofa, sometimes you've got to stop and look over your shoulder to see where you're going. And that's what that did for me. So, thank you. I work in anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. I currently work for Infrastructure Canada until tomorrow, and then I'm moving over to immigration with the Settlement Integration Program. There are things that we can do. Doesn't matter where you're from. This Ottawa is a government town. But there are things that we can do in our everyday workspace to make things better for, yes, Black communities, but for all communities. Black history for me is not the month of February. This year we have 29 days. Yeah, no. Like it's 365 days. And I feel that we need to make a difference. I don't think that the responsibility lies solely on Black folks to make things. Black history is Canadian history. That's all I want to say. Hi, I'm a Somali first-generation immigrant. I just wanted to say that I stumbled upon the Black Canadian experience watching Black Ice. It was the documentary that was done, I think, in conjunction with the CBC, Black Afro. I think Nova Scotians, who had their own league of hockey players, and like right now, sorry, I'm a little emotional because it's coming here and growing up here. We didn't know, like my friend and I were talking about it. They never talk about it in schools. I'm one of those kids that grew up in the school system in Ottawa, never mentioned Black Canadians. So I thought everyone was an immigrant like me to discover that we've been here for 400 years. So I just want to say thank you to the team. And my question is, how challenging was this to put together the funding? Where did it come from, and the 80 chapters? I'm curious to see when we'll see those 80 chapters because they need to be told.
Sandy,
Sure, yeah. Well, I will say that CBC put, in terms of funding for this documentary, they spent more on this documentary than they ever had any other documentary series when it was greenlit. So it is historic. It was greenlit in 2020. There was some, there was like some auspicious timing there, I think, too. But like, I think that there were some things about the world that made that happen. Because in being critical, I don't know why. I'm sure people have pitched this before, so I don't know why it took that long. But I will say that in terms of that funding, CBC did put quite a bit of funding there. In terms of how difficult it was to put the stories together, I can't describe to you how monumentally difficult this was, because we learned so much. We had expert historians and academics from all over the country coming together to be a part of this, plus people who were just doing work in the arts in their industry coming together to be a part of this. And everybody had stories that they wanted to include. The first drafts of the stories were so long. And then, we had the archival researchers doing all of this research, and at some point you have to say, oh my God, we have way too much. And you're like, what do you do? Like there should maybe be a season 2 or season 3, like I'm not sure, right? It was very, very hard to cut that down. I mean, you can imagine, you saw all the different settlements on the map at the end. How do you make a decision to say, it's so hard. It feels heartbreaking to go through something and to say, well, we're going to choose this story and not this story, because you're wondering to yourself, what are you actually saying when you're doing that, and hoping that instead at some point you'll get another opportunity. And so there's like a digital addendum that's going to be a part of this too, where there's a little bit more information coming out. There's a website that's being created where a little bit more of that archival research can be held. There's a book that's being put together with contributors from across the country where even more of the information can come out. I think people who are working on this just want to, as much as possible, just get all of that information out there because it's housed in so many different places, and it's kind of hard to get it. Some of the archival stuff that exists in Canada is like you have to pay for access, and so it's kind of hard to get access to it and then to make it public. So it's really quite challenging. It was, so I mean, the answer was impossibly hard, but you know, we did a thing.
Thus, my recommendation that we need our cultural institutions that can house our resources. We need a Canadian Schomburg or National Museum like in the United States, which I've pitched, but people don't seem to embrace it because then you can have not only the reservoir of all the things, but so much knowledge disappears because people have disappeared. For example, you know, there was another documentary done in the 70s, I think, Fields of Endless Day, another one called Seven Shades of Pale. But these things get erased as time moves on because they're no longer part of current discussions. So this is why I'm really saying that institutions are very important if we are going to bridge the continuation of knowledge and the activation of knowledge all the time, because people are always surprised when, in fact, these things have always been known or promoted, but not necessarily on the national agenda.
Okay, you're not the first one to call for a Black museum, so.
Oh, no.
And they exist all over the world, not just in the US. They're all over the world. I mean, it's actually an outlier that Canada does not have a large Black museum.
All right, how are we doing for time, Katie? One more question, okay.
Oh, two more questions.
Okay, maybe, can we do two more?
Two more questions.
I couldn't help but notice that there was a shadow over the presentation of you sharing the loss of your community. But when you come here and share stories that Canadians have never heard before, we're growing together. And to me, that reflects the community. You're still here. And we're a community together that's growing and learning from these stories that you're sharing today. So thank you for coming out here and sharing that with us.
Hi, I am with the Ontario Black History Society. I came up from Toronto today specifically for this event. I met David Woods in Halifax because I led a tour there, and Katie joined us when we led that tour there on behalf of the OBHS and the Owen Sound Emancipation Festival. I identify as a fifth-generation Black person whose family came up on the Underground Railroad. I have a great-grandfather who I have traced to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and in Owen Sound. They have a very vibrant community that has celebrated Emancipation Day. This year will be 162 years. I've had my family settled there in the 1850s. And all this work that you are doing, all the work that societies like the OBHS are doing, we can't do enough of it to tell these stories. And I know for a fact that there was an announcement made by the Province of Ontario Minister Lecce today, saying that there was going to be some Black education taught in schools. I have gone in schools myself and made presentations on behalf of, first, my grandson, and then to all the other children in his school. And we all must do this. We all must tell these stories. We must tell them loud and say it proud.
So much of what we've seen is a really beautiful, wonderful celebration of overcoming adversity and difficulty and seeing a celebration of Black culture. I think my question is, in a lot of people's cases, I think we're carrying a lot of intergenerational trauma. As you said, Cheryl, there's a lot of Black people that don't even like themselves. And I think in a lot of ways, all the messages around us tell us to change ourselves, to change our hair, to change this to, and I grew up in a household where, my mother did not celebrate Black culture. Every message that we got was to be not like who you are, to be someone else. So I guess my question is for people that didn't grow up with this history and with this knowledge and with this pride, how do you encourage folks that are Black to celebrate this part of themselves and to reconnect with this part of their identity?
I'm not sure CBC can personalize all its, to every single person. But what is important is that we just show the evidences of things on a level that people can see, because then people can attach to the things that they want, and need or figure out to understand. Because I said, when we started the cultural awareness youth groups in the schools, there were blacks who hated themselves in the sense that they were always taught they were outcasts. In that group, they became interesting because they talked leftovers of Gullah, and I knew what Gullah was, so they could explain that this came from South Carolina and basket, all these things that had never been verified. Their history had never been verified. So all I can say is, people, every individual has a personal need that they might be looking for in blackness or reconciling themselves to this. But it really comes from us just putting it, acknowledging all our different histories, because it's not just one thing. I grew up with the kids who went to the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, for example, and some of them were damaged by that institution, but some of them also saved by that institution. And so again, we can't reconcile all the different damages, because some of them come from blackness, some of them come from poverty, some of them come from, as you were talking about your mom, I grew up with a woman in Shelburne who called her own people the N-word, even though she herself had come from that, and encouraged them never to acknowledge even their own relatives. So these things exist, but again, the corroborating evidence of truth and stories, and even as a writer, that you can actually acknowledge that kind of experience in a book, allows someone to see themselves and then find themselves in their different ways. But again, institutions are very important because they allow that dialogue to be continuous, not just once in a while, and not just and not just static. You can continually have that evolving kind of thing happening.
Cheryl, I think you had something to say.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, that's such a great question. I think I agree with what David has said, that there are some people who can't be healed from that particular trauma, but there are many who can embark on a journey just by hearing one story. For some people, that's all they need. And each of us in our own way are storytellers, and you never know where that story will land. So I think each of you can also be storytellers and can ask people to watch this series, and you don't know how that will reverberate throughout communities and who this series will find who really needs it. And I often think about, when I'm writing fiction in particular, I think about there's one person out there who needs this story. So I think stories are very powerful, and I just feel that we can't heal everyone, but we can bring solace, comfort, and a sense of belonging to many, many, many through this kind of work.
Okay. With that, I want to thank the audience for coming out tonight, for your amazing questions, and for this amazing panel for sharing your stories and witnessing to our history and our future. Thank you so much.